Berlin, spring 1945. The last stronghold, the last order, the last hopes for salvation. In a city turned into a stone labyrinth, the fate of the entire world is being decided. Soviet troops stormed the capital of the Third Reich with unprecedented courage, encountering desperate resistance, fear, and the ashes of destroyed neighborhoods. This operation changed the course of history forever, and forever inscribed new names in the book of human memory. What was behind this triumph? And at what cost was victory achieved? Today, we will reveal all the historical facts of the greatest battle of the century, the Battle of Berlin. The spring of 1945 was a time when the outcome of World War II was being decided across the European theater of war. All of Europe was engulfed in the roar of the final battles. The Soviet command understood that the Berlin direction was the key to the entire future history not only of the war, but also of the new post-war architecture of the world. Berlin remained the last bastion of the Third Reich, a city for which thousands of German soldiers and officers were prepared to fight to the death, and where the entire leadership of Nazi Germany, headed by Adolf Hitler, was concentrated. The looming operation required maximum effort, the greatest preparation, and precise coordination not only between the armies, but also between the Allies, in the form of the Western powers. Millions of lives were at stake, as was the fate of Germany, and therefore of all of Europe. In addition to purely military aspects, the situation in the spring of 1945 was fraught with complex politics. Every day of delay meant additional casualties among the civilian population and combatants. Back in winter, the Soviet High Command began to draw up plans for the final defeat of the fascist center. At that time, a huge fist was forming across the entire Western Front, from the northern outskirts of Pomerania to the banks of the Oder River. The troops of Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov and Ivan Stepanovich Konev, the famous Vasily Danilovich Sokolovsky, the legendary Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky, and self-sacrificing divisions and corps led by experienced officers. Only the remnants of the Wehrmacht, SS units, volunteers from the Volkssturm, and foreign legions allied with the Germans could oppose this armada. From the beginning of March, the pace of redeployment of the Soviet armies increased to the limit. At night, echelons moved with tanks, self-propelled guns, artillery, armored personnel carriers, motorized infantry, food supplies, ammunition, and fuel. Reconnaissance was gathering pace, and reports were coming in about changes in German troops, new lines of fortifications, obstacles, and minefields. Every commander, starting with the division commander, knew that a fatal mistake here could cost the lives of thousands of people. The main task was to break through the enemy's ingenious defenses, layer by layer, reach Berlin itself, and deliver the final blow to the heart of the Third Reich. The psychological situation among the Soviet and German troops was different. Among the Red Army soldiers, there was a growing sense of the approaching end, fatigue from deprivation, but also a spirit of victory. Ahead lay the city they had dreamed of for 4 long years. Inside Germany itself, chaos was growing. Panic among refugees, streams of retreating soldiers and officers. Berlin was gradually turning into a besieged citadel. An important feature of the preparation for the operation was the extensive logistics. New divisional reserves were moving along the highways, and reports were coming into headquarters from all fronts. Military engineers, sappers, road and railway troops worked around the clock to repair roads, build bridges, and camouflage positions. The general staff of the USSR worked in a mode of constant change. The fronts maneuvered, took into account the reaction of the Germans, and reinforced the directions of possible strikes. The importance of intelligence cannot be overstated. In the run-up to the assault, special forces worked to identify weak points in the enemy's defenses, gather information on the location of tanks, artillery, and ammunition supplies, and neutralize sabotage groups. Smersh forces and special agents were everywhere, keeping order even within their own troops. During this period, the atmosphere of tension was fueled by constant orders prohibiting looting, instructing on how to treat prisoners of war, and emphasizing responsibility for discipline. Everything had to be extremely organized, despite the fatigue of the troops and the pressure from the front. The Soviet commander-in-chief took into account not only strategic reports, but also political aspects. The Allies were already approaching the Elbe, and the distribution of post-war spheres of influence depended on who would take Berlin first. The memoirs of those who participated in those events reflect a vivid feeling. The significance of that battle went far beyond mere military success. Every marshal and every officer had their own personal fears and an acute sense of the historic moment. By early April, all the directions in which the attack was planned were saturated with troops. According to Soviet intelligence, Berlin had been turned into a fortress by that time. A circular defense, dozens of kilometers of anti-tank ditches, barricades, a network of reinforced concrete pillboxes, and mined bridges. However, it was in the spring that the foundations for future victory were laid. The colossal efforts, the bitter experience of previous battles, and the millions of lives lost on the way to this final battle became the foundation for the decisive blow that would shape the world for decades to come. The overall command of the Berlin operation was entrusted to the best of the best. At the top was Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, who personally determined the priorities and timing of the offensive. The main actors were Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, commander of the First Belarusian Front, and Marshal Ivan Stepanovich Konev, commander of the First Ukrainian Front. The group of key commanders also included Marshals Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky and Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky, commanders of army corps and divisions with vast combat experience. In the Berlin operation, the Soviet command achieved unique coordination. Operations were planned at the highest headquarters in Moscow, discussed with representatives of the fronts, and adjusted based on intelligence and weather conditions. Supply lines were organized for maximum reliability and a continuous flow of reinforcements and material supplies. The front headquarters included representatives of all services: communications, intelligence, artillery, aviation, engineering troops, as well as political departments, which played an important role in motivating the personnel. There was a hidden struggle between the chief commanders. Georgy Zhukov was determined to be the first to break into the city, considering this success a personal and national triumph. Ivan Konev, not inferior in combat experience and determination, maneuvered his units to the west to cut off the retreat of German forces in the south and southwest. The work of army commanders, such as Pavel Ivanovich Batov, Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov, and Alexei Semyonovich Berzarin, who became the first commandant of the Soviet administration in Berlin after the end of the fighting, was of particular importance. The headquarters also played a critical role in operational management. Here, round-the-clock meetings were held, codes were exchanged, and operational maps were processed. Every step of the Soviet troops was accompanied by precise coordination between the Air Force, artillery, tank corps, and engineering units. Signalmen were also in a special position. Any loss of radio communication could lead to a poorly coordinated strike or even a loss of momentum in the offensive. Soviet marshals and generals often joined the front lines, personally inspecting areas of future breakthroughs. They had at their disposal staff officers, numerous cartographic materials, and detailed diagrams of enemy fortifications. The generals tried to maintain contact with their subordinates through military meetings, where each commander could express his opinion and convey his thoughts on the organization of the battle. The commanders deserve special mention. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was distinguished by his firmness, will to win, and ability to make quick decisions in extreme conditions. He was known for sparing neither himself nor others, demanding maximum effort from everyone. Ivan Stepanovich Konev, on the contrary, was renowned for his operational flexibility and attention to detail, skillfully maneuvering units along the front and using unexpected moves to achieve his objectives with minimal losses. On the Western Front, near the Elbe, the Allies were also making strategic advances. The Anglo-American command was getting used to the rapid advance of the Soviet armies to the east and was adjusting its own plans. An important element of inter-Allied cooperation was the coordination of meeting points on the Elbe and the conditions for subsequent operations in order to avoid unnecessary clashes or delays. Despite the tension, discipline among the staff was at the highest level. Any failure could jeopardize the most important stage of the war. Directives were constantly coming in from the High Command on mobilizing reserves, suppressing panic, combating desertion, and restoring order in the units. Behind each marshal stood a team of senior officers and generals with personal war experience, which allowed them to quickly resolve any problems that arose. Thus, the success of the Berlin operation was largely determined by the personal qualities and experience of the leadership, a well-coordinated command system, and the ability to concentrate the main forces at the right moment in key areas. Command decisions were sometimes made literally on the brink of possibility, under time pressure and extraordinary circumstances. But this was precisely what ensured one of the most spectacular victories in world military history. By the beginning of April 1945, colossal forces from both sides were concentrated on the approaches to Berlin. On the Soviet side, the combined forces numbered almost 2.5 million men. More than 150 divisions in the ranks of the 1st Belarusian Front under the command of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, and the 1st Ukrainian Front under the command of Marshal Ivan Konev. They included about 6,500 tanks, approximately 4,500 aircraft, and at least 40,000 guns and mortars. Powerful engineering units, over 200 bridge battalions, and numerous communications and supply units were also involved. Additional Soviet reserves were brought up to the rear. Fresh rifle divisions, tank corps, and motorized rapid reaction groups. Airborne units and assault engineering brigades, capable of quickly creating passages through minefields and destroying barricades, were of great importance. Many units included a large number of veterans with experience in winter combat, operations to break through fortified areas, and street fighting, which meant that the personnel could be counted on to remain determined and well-trained, even in the most difficult conditions. This armored force was opposed by the fierce but exhausted defenses of the Wehrmacht and SS troops. The remnants of Army Group Vistula, led by General Gottfried Heinrici, the Volkssturm, special battalions of cadets, Luftwaffe units, police units, and in the final days, militias made up of local residents were called upon to defend the city. In total, up to 1 million people were mobilized to defend Berlin. Their weapons were a motley assortment. The latest anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts were mixed with outdated rifles, machine guns, anti-aircraft weapons, and street barricades. The city's defensive structures were a complex system designed to slow down the enemy's advance as much as possible. To the north of the city, trenches, dugouts, bunkers, and anti-tank barriers were built. On the outskirts of Berlin, Hitler's troops blew up bridges, mined sewer systems, and planted explosives on buildings of strategic importance. Each section of the future offensive was closely monitored and patrolled. Particular attention was paid to the central sector, where government buildings, a large number of ammunition depots, Tempelhof airfield, and a subway system adapted for the rapid transfer of troops were located. By the start of the operation, both sides were completely exhausted. The Soviet units had experience in crossing large water obstacles, fighting in the cities of East Prussia and Silesia, and street battles. Many units were reduced in number due to losses in previous operations, but were replenished by reserves that had been transferred. The Germans had much more serious problems. The mass mobilization of students, pensioners, teenagers, and foreigners from the armies of the Third Reich's allies spoke of extreme exhaustion and despair. Engineering troops played a huge role. Before the assault on Berlin, hundreds of minefields were located and cleared in every direction. The approaches to bridges across the Oder River were demined, and pontoon and quickly constructed wooden bridges were prepared. Engineering teams with highly experienced commanders, armed with the latest engineering equipment, were operating at all key locations. It is important to understand that every day and every hour of preparation involved not only military, but also information warfare. Propaganda leaflets were distributed en masse throughout the city. Radio broadcasts called for surrender. A network of Soviet intelligence agents was at work, and partisan groups operated within the city and its suburbs. The last weeks before the start of the operation were a time of intense fighting on the outskirts of the city. Some areas were turned into real fortresses, where the Nazis intended to hold out until the last bullet. Even children and women were organized into defense units to support the military. Despair grew on both sides. Some waited for a quick end to the war, while others clung to the impossible hope of holding out. All this created a tense emotional backdrop, foreshadowing the tragic and heroic events to come. The operation to storm Berlin began at dawn on April 16, 1945. The troops of the First Belarusian Front, commanded by Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, and the First Ukrainian Front, led by Ivan Stepanovich Konyev, received orders to begin a large-scale artillery barrage, which was intended to crush the first line of German defenses on the heights of Seelow, correct pronunciation Seelow, and on the southeastern approaches to the city. A few minutes before the attack, the sky above the front line of the German defenses was lit up by thousands of tracer shells, flashes from multiple rocket launchers, and the blows of heavy howitzers and katyushas. The entire space in front of the trenches turned into a sea of fire and smoke. At that moment, panic reigned in the Hitlerite trenches. The sky crackled with explosions, the ground shook beneath their feet, and communications were cut off almost instantly. All this prepared the ground for the main strike. After a record-breaking artillery barrage, Soviet tanks, assault troops, and motorized rifle units went into battle. The main strike was delivered through the Seelow Heights, one of the most fortified positions on the entire front. The best units of the Wehrmacht and SS troops were concentrated here, and there were numerous anti-tank ditches, minefields, and machine gun emplacements. Under cover of smoke and dust, Soviet units advanced, encountering desperate resistance, continuous fire, and counterattacks. The first day of the assault did not bring a decisive result. Despite its huge advantage in numbers and equipment, the Soviet army suffered heavy losses. In some areas, the advance was only a few hundred meters. Fatigue, the difficult terrain, and the stubbornness of the defenders took their toll. However, by evening, the front commanders had agreed on measures to build up reserves, adjust artillery strikes, and bring in additional sapper and pontoon units. On April 17 and 18, the fighting became particularly fierce. New reserves appeared on both sides of the battlefield. The Germans threw their last tank formations into counterattacks, bringing in freshly mobilized Wunderwaffe, German for wonder weapon, and Volkssturm units, relying on the system of city roads, wooded areas, and water barriers. Soviet commanders changed the direction of their attacks, introduced maneuverable groups, and attacked from the flank. At the height of the day, there was a struggle for every hill, stronghold, and village. On the northern and southern flanks of the front, the offensive was accompanied by massive air support. Soviet attack aircraft and bombers, despite losses from anti-aircraft artillery, struck enemy columns, railway junctions, and crossings. At the same time, tank units searched for weak spots in the defense in order to cut off the enemy group and prevent it from regrouping. The battle for the Seelow Heights was an extremely difficult test for the Soviet troops. By the end of the third day, the German defenses began to crack, with losses on both sides numbering in the thousands. One of the turning points came after a massive encircling maneuver, when the troops managed to break through the chain of firing points and reach open ground, from where there was a direct road to the Spree River. The psychological pressure only intensified. Every success came at the cost of incredible tension. Many soldiers recalled that the noise, smoke, and blood literally never left the battlefield. Officers and commanders worked to exhaustion, often advancing personally to the front lines. The final stage of the first day of the operation was the advance of the Red Army's frontline units to the outskirts of Berlin. The Germans retreated, dug new positions in urban areas, mined bridges and buildings, and set up barricades from trams, trucks, furniture, and iron rails. The entire city was preparing for a fierce defense, and the Red Army increased its firepower to the limit. Ahead lay Berlin itself, a symbol of power and the end of the war for everyone. After bloody battles on the Seelow heights, the Red Army reached the outskirts of Berlin. The advancing troops were met by an expanded urban area, built up with narrow streets, parks, industrial zones, and waterways, among which the Spree Valley, Lichtenberg, and Marzahn stood out. The German command understood that their last hope of holding back the enemy lay in using the city's buildings, which had been turned into a maze of defensive positions, firing points, and barricades. Every house, subway station, pier, and bridge was turned into a fortified point of resistance. Machine gunners and mortar gunners were stationed in the basements, while snipers took up positions on the upper floors. On the orders of General Heinrich's headquarters, a flexible defense tactic was used in the fighting. After coming under fire, small groups would retreat to new positions, allowing the artillery to fire on the advancing enemy. Civilians lived in appalling conditions. Many were driven into basements or shelters, and an atmosphere of fear and despair prevailed everywhere. During this period, the engineering units of the Red Army played a huge role. Sappers cleared debris, cleared passageways, and defused landmines. Anti-tank and tank units engaged in rapid street fighting, destroying firing points. Tanks 3485 and the famous self-propelled guns ISU-152 became a real defense against snipers and grenade launchers entrenched in houses. Days of fierce fighting followed. The suburbs of Berlin, Pankow, Schöneweide, Karlshorst, Wedding, and others, became the scene of brutal street battles. Every intersection captured cost dozens or hundreds of lives. The battle for the Schönhauser Alley subway station was particularly bloody, where German sappers blew up a tunnel and attempted to use underground passages for counterattacks. Soviet assault groups fought to force the enemy to abandon their positions and retreat to the center of the capital. At the same time, some German units tried to break out of the city to the west, but the advancing units of the First Ukrainian Front cut off their retreat. Red Army artillery fired accurately at the columns leaving the city. Blown-up bridges delayed the fugitives, and panic among the civilian population only grew. Many Germans, seeing the extent of the destruction and the inevitability of defeat, tried to surrender before the deadline set by the headquarters, but the city still resisted. By the end of April, the advancing troops had reached the inner defensive line. The streets were littered with burned-out cars, wrecked trams, and barricades made of furniture and debris from industrial buildings. Soldiers and civilians were dying. The chaos of war had reached its peak. The city was slowly but surely being drawn into the feverish pulse of the final battles. By the end of April, Berlin was surrounded. The Red Army had captured key transport hubs, severed communications between German units, and cut off the city center. Under the conditions of a prolonged siege, logistics and preparations for the decisive assault on the Reichstag, the symbol of the Third Reich, came to the fore. Soviet units advanced, gradually tightening the ring. Troops occupied ministry buildings, railway stations, hospitals, and large factories. Each new position was accompanied by continuous firefights. The enemy not only defended itself, but also made desperate sorties, used its last reserves, and tried to maintain communications between sectors. Reconnaissance became particularly important. Groups of demolition fighters and military intelligence officers were at the forefront of the assault, gathering information on the location of firing points, barrier systems, and the density of forces. Demonstrating heroism, the scouts cleared the way for the main units under fire and formed mobile strike groups. Meanwhile, the civilian population found itself in even more dire isolation. People hid in basements and shelters for days on end, suffering from a lack of water, food, and medicine. An ambush could be lurking behind every courtyard or house entrance, and fire could open from any direction. Anarchy reigned in the center of Berlin. There were almost no unified command structures, orders were given on the fly, and an atmosphere of chaos and mortal fear hung in the air. Particularly fierce clashes broke out at intersections and squares. Merciless battles took place near the Brandenburg Gate between Soviet tank crews and the surviving German crews. Here too, units of Red Army penal battalions, distinguished by their particular desperation, entered the fray. Hand-to-hand combat took place on stairwells, accompanied by gunfire, screams, and explosions. Fires engulfed entire areas of the city. The Soviet command attached particular importance to preparing for the assault on the Reichstag and other government buildings. Artillery carefully zeroed in on targets, engineers prepared approaches, and called in a tank fire curtain. Assault troops formed from experienced veterans advanced to the front line. Their main task was to capture the upper floors, suppress machine gun positions, and open passages for the main forces. The atmosphere at headquarters was tense. Every hour, information about fresh reinforcements, orders, and supply routes was crucial. The hours passed. The Red Army tightened its ring. The German defenses creaked but held. The hour of the final battle for the symbol of power, the Reichstag building, where the fate of the entire war was being decided, was drawing nearer. The storming of the Reichstag was the culmination of the Berlin operation and one of the most vivid symbols of victory. By the morning of April 29, the advance units of the 161st, 79th, and 100th Rifle Divisions reached the Parliament building, which was under fire from all sides. The German troops defending the Reichstag included grenadiers, SS men, the Volkssturm, and the remnants of the officer corps. The entire building was riddled with firing points. Machine guns, mortars, and automatic weapons were firing from windows, basements, and balconies. The assault began with a massive artillery barrage, after which Soviet soldiers rushed toward the walls under cover of smoke. Sappers played a special role, breaking down doors and creating breaches for the soldiers to break into the building. A bloody hand-to-hand battle unfolded on the stairwells. According to the recollections of participants, each flight of stairs was defended to the last bullet, with cries of "Für Reichstag" and the use of grenades, Molotov cocktails, and even pieces of furniture. The attack plan involved a simultaneous assault from several sides. Some companies entered from the Republic Square, others from the West Wing. Assault groups under the command of Major Mikhail Alexievich Egorov, Senior Sergeant Melaton Varlamovich Kantaria, Lieutenant Alexei Nikolaevich Berest and their comrades fought their way up the floors, advancing towards the dome. At each level, they had to overcome fierce resistance. The battle for control of the main rooms lasted almost a day. At midnight on April 29-30, several groups broke through to the dome of the building, where attempts were made to hoist the red banner. The official raising took place on the morning of April 30. The legendary Victory banner flew on the facade. This was a signal to the entire city. The defense was collapsing, and the morale of the German troops was rapidly declining. The losses on both sides were enormous. Soldiers died not only from gunfire, but also from rubble, explosions, and collapsing ceilings. Medical assistance was provided directly under heavy fire, with military medics showing true self-sacrifice. The culmination of the storming of the Reichstag went down in history as an example of heroism, military cunning, and human fortitude. On that day, it became clear that the outcome of the war could no longer be changed. The symbol of victory flew over the devastated capital, and although there were still pockets of resistance ahead, the fate of Berlin and the Third Reich was sealed. The success of the Berlin operation was largely ensured by the exceptional work of the frontline units: rifle, tank, artillery, sapper, and assault groups. Firepower, precise coordination between different branches of the armed forces, competent logistics, and well-organized command systems allowed the Red Army, despite fierce enemy resistance, to gradually subdue one neighborhood after another. The main striking force remained the infantry divisions, among which the soldiers of the 105th, 269th, and 108th Guards Rifle Divisions distinguished themselves. In urban warfare, they operated in small assault groups of 5 to 10 men, armed with submachine guns, hand grenades, and anti-tank rifles. This approach allowed them to flexibly change the direction of their attack and respond instantly to German counterattacks. The arteries of the offensive were supported by powerful artillery. About 40,000 guns and mortars rained tens of thousands of shells on the city. Each new neighborhood was preceded by a volley of katyushas and heavy howitzers, which destroyed the rows of barricades, firing points, and German command posts. The artillerymen had to maneuver right on the streets, in narrow passages, quickly deploy and open fire on newly identified targets. The key to success was speed, accuracy, and close communication with the advancing infantry units. Sappers played a special role. Under constant fire, they cleared bridges of mines, prepared passages for equipment, defused booby traps, and saved thousands of soldiers from death. Technological innovations developed during the war found application in Berlin. Explosive charges for breaking through breaches, engineering equipment for clearing debris, and mobile crossings. Tank units, among which the crews commanded by Mikhail Ilyich Katukov and Pavel Semenovich Rotmistrov distinguished themselves most, fought in a new way, not in masses, but in small groups, maneuvering between the rubble. The battles were house to house in nature. For every intersection, bridge, and building, tank losses were high, with many vehicles knocked out by explosions from Faustpatronen and Molotov cocktails. But at the decisive moment, their support remained invaluable. The signalmen and radio operators deserve a special mention. Thanks to their self-sacrifice, motorized and infantry units almost always remained in contact. Any interruptions were eliminated under fire, often at the cost of their own lives. Their work made it possible to carry out large-scale maneuvers in a ceremonial and synchronized manner amid chaos and destruction. Financial, technical, and moral support for the frontline troops was the key to victory. Even in the most dire conditions, no one lost contact with the command, and every unit knew its task and the limits of its responsibility. This ensured that the days were numbered until the final surrender of the last stronghold of the Third Reich. The siege of Berlin was a severe test for everyone who found themselves inside the city walls in the final weeks of the war. The civilian population experienced a rapid and irreversible collapse of the familiar order. Many city services had ceased to function in mid-April. Transportation was at a standstill or destroyed, water supply networks were disrupted due to damage, and medical care was available only in the surviving sections of supply routes and in a few hospitals. Both adults and children spent several days in a row sleeping in basements, underground passages, and bomb shelters. With undisguised horror, people waited for the air raids to end, and when silence fell, they began searching for water and food among the ruins and destruction. Many who had lost their homes wandered around the city in an attempt to find their relatives or settle in small groups of refugees. There were frequent cases of epidemics, disorder, panic, and despair. Documentary evidence shows that with each passing day, more and more city dwellers lost hope. A different battle unfolded on the streets of Berlin. Remnants of the Wehrmacht, Volkssturm units, and armed city militias tried to maintain control of the districts. But their forces dwindled with each passing day. Groups of teenagers with rifles and homemade grenades were a common sight. Anyone who could hold a weapon was drawn into the defense. Many of these young defenders were killed or wounded in the first clashes, as they had no real combat experience. Women played a special role. They cared for the wounded, organized food, and helped clear rubble. There were many cases where girls voluntarily participated in transporting the wounded under fire. Everyday life virtually disappeared. The air was filled with the roar of artillery, flashes of fire, screams, and moans. Despite the horrors of war, there were signs of human solidarity on both sides. Red Army soldiers provided first aid to prisoners and civilians, and local residents helped Soviet wounded whenever possible. Inside the German garrisons, an atmosphere of fatalism and despair reigned. After the first days of the siege, there were mass attempts to desert, abandon combat positions, and commit suicide among soldiers and officers who did not want to be taken prisoner. The leadership tried to maintain order with threatening orders, but gradually, everything collapsed. Germany was no longer fighting so much for victory as for a more dignified fate for itself and its loved ones. The city was on the brink of disaster. Hungry dogs roamed everywhere, and the moans of the wounded and screams of terror echoed through the streets. With each passing day, the front line narrowed and the number of survivors dwindled. Berlin became a symbol, not only of the defeat of a regime, but of the tragedy of an entire era. By the middle of the last week of April, the most fierce and dramatic battles were taking place in the center of Berlin. The density of troops increased dramatically. While it was still possible to maneuver on the outskirts, the streets in the heart of the city became an arena where every meter was fought for. The central squares and avenues of Berlin, Unter den Linden, Alexanderplatz, Müllerstrasse, were littered with barricades and street blockades. Soviet tank groups advanced in chains, covering the advancing infantry. Every block, every large building, hotels, bank buildings, and the central station were under siege. The Germans defended their positions fiercely, organizing ambushes using all possible means, from flamethrowers to anti-tank guns. The Red Army artillery fired carpet fire at identified pockets of resistance, supported by air raids, although the dense buildings prevented wide maneuverability. The battle for the telegraph office, the Ministry of Internal Affairs building, and the City Hall deserves special mention. Bloody clashes went on here for several days. Each floor gradually passed from hand to hand. Soldiers attacked up smoking staircases, from window to window, sometimes even through holes in the floors. Sometimes a single group of soldiers managed to hold several positions in a day, participating in both the offensive and the defense. All types of weapons were used, including captured German grenades, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. Commanders on both sides showed the highest level of skill. Battalion commanders Igor Petrovich Dragunsky, Maxim Alexeyevich Papivin, and Jan Karlovich Blavatnik distinguished themselves. It was their ability to interact with headquarters and quickly seize the initiative that allowed them to crush German strongholds in the central streets. The difficulties of the offensive were compounded by the presence of underground communications. The enemy used subway tunnels, basements, and drainage systems to create unexpected pockets of resistance or for sudden counterattacks. In response, Soviet sappers walled up passages, laid mine traps, and threw smoke grenades. Each such success came at a huge cost. As Marshal Zhukov noted in his memoirs, the fighting in the city center was the heaviest and most merciless in my entire military life. However, it was tactical flexibility, massive artillery support, and the courage of the fighters that ultimately secured the breakthrough through the central defense nodes. From the very first day of the operation, air support became particularly important. Red Army aircraft provided both reconnaissance and direct combat operations against enemy positions. Hundreds of Il-12 and P-12 attack aircraft, dive bombers, La-19 and Yak-22 fighters pursued German columns on the outskirts, destroyed anti-aircraft and field artillery positions, and prevented the transfer of reserves. In urban combat, the Air Force had limited capabilities due to the density of buildings and the threat of friendly fire. But the psychological pressure from the deafening raids was enormous. Often, a short raid by a group of attack aircraft was enough to disrupt enemy supplies, cut off retreating Germans, or thwart their attempts to regroup. German anti-aircraft artillery remained a dangerous enemy. Many crews were killed during low passes over the defense lines, receiving numerous hits after completing their combat missions. However, tank battles determined the main character of the fighting. The tactic of urban fire duels, unique to the second half of the war, shaped the final stage of the battle. The crews of the T-34-85, IS-2, Su-100, and Su-152 demonstrated resourcefulness. They used armored vehicles to suppress sniper positions, used houses as cover, and made detours around courtyards to avoid coming under targeted fire from Faust gunners. In particularly intense pockets of fighting, tanks served as fists, rolling up to enemy positions, destroying barricades, and opening passages for the infantry. Where tanks got stuck in concrete, sappers and artillerymen came to the rescue. German crews of Tigers, Panthers, and self-propelled guns fought fiercely, but were often forced to abandon their vehicles and retreat under cover of fog and smoke. Street duels between tanks and self-propelled guns ended in flashes and ramming, even in front of civilians. Victory in the air and on the ground was made possible by the synchronized work of the headquarters, the motivation of the crews, and the high professionalism of the signalmen. Every German plane shot down, every artillery battery destroyed, every tank column smashed, struck fear into the hearts of the capital's defenders. It was this moral and tactical advantage that ultimately allowed the Red Army to shift the front in its favor. By May 1945, Berlin was completely surrounded by Red Army troops. The last days before the surrender were filled with fear and chaos. The last groups of defenders rushed through the streets, unified command structures disappeared, and panic and despair reigned among the German population. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in the main command bunker on Wilhelmstrasse. Power in the city and the country passed to Admiral Karl Dönitz. On the same day, the first parliamentarians were sent from the Reichstag garrison, and white flags appeared on the facades of a number of buildings. However, isolated groups were still fighting for every floor and building, clinging to children's and underground shelters, unwilling to surrender. The terms of surrender were negotiated between the Soviet headquarters and German parliamentarians throughout the night and into the following day. The aversion to defeat, fear of captivity, and fear for their families all exacerbated the atmosphere. However, the flow of prisoners was already in the tens of thousands. Small units surrendered en masse after seeing that resistance was no longer possible. The official surrender of the Berlin garrison took place on May 2. By this time, fighting had ceased in almost the entire city, with only isolated shots coming from the Zoo and Tempelhof airfield. Soviet troops quickly disarmed the defenders, organized the evacuation of the population from dangerous areas, and began to clean up the aftermath of the destruction. A long and painful process began to clear minefields, remove debris from the streets, and recover the bodies of the dead. The Soviet soldiers and officers were overcome with a sense of victory. But, as their memoirs note, there were no celebrations. Exhaustion, the weight of what they had seen, and the bitterness of their losses were overwhelming. For many, Berlin remained a city of tragedy and a reminder of the inevitable price of war. Germany officially acknowledged its defeat. The European war was over. The capture of Berlin marked not only the end of the greatest war of the 20th century, but also the beginning of a new historical era for the entire world. The Berlin operation determined the political map of Europe, shaped the post-war structure of the continent, and became the prologue to the Cold War. After the surrender of the Third Reich, the influence of the USSR grew dramatically. The Soviet Union became one of two superpowers, and its army gained a foothold in Central and Eastern Europe. The main consequence of the operation was the so-called dividing line through German territory. In the West, there were Allied occupation zones, and in the East, there was Soviet military administration. The city of Berlin became a symbol and arena of future confrontation. Following the victory over Nazism, the long work of rebuilding the destroyed countries, repatriating refugees, and searching for prisoners of war and deportees began. The fate of millions of people after the capture of Berlin was dramatic. A huge number of German families found themselves in the Soviet or Allied occupation zones, and entire generations were displaced across new borders. Large-scale denazification processes began. with the persecution of high-ranking officials and military personnel, accompanied by isolated acts of revenge. Residents of the occupied territories faced food shortages, devastation, unemployment, and disunity. The consequences of famine, epidemics, and population migration would be felt for many years to come. For Europe, the Berlin Operation marked the beginning of a new political reality. The USSR consolidated its position in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. New People's Democratic governments were formed in these territories. The new era was also marked by mass trials of war criminals and the Nuremberg trials, which shaped international law on genocide and crimes against humanity. The events of May 1945 determined the appearance of the German capital for decades to come. The destruction left by the war was so great that the city had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. The symbol of the collapse of the old world was a divided Berlin, soon to be split into eastern and western sectors. Traces of the fighting remained on the streets for a long time, with charred building ruins, inscriptions in Russian, and monuments to the fallen. For many years, international politics became an arena of rivalry between two systems, Western and Socialist. The Berlin Operation ended one era, but ushered in a new one, an era of global geopolitical confrontation. It transformed the consciousness of nations and served as a reminder of the fragility of world peace. Decades later, myths, half-truths, and historical hypotheses continue to swirl around the outcome and details of the Berlin Operation. One of the main points of contention is the number of casualties among the Red Army, German troops and civilians. Radically different estimates have been published over the years, introducing an element of political manipulation into the analysis of events. The second popular question was the race to Berlin between the Western Allies and the USSR. In the post-war years, opinions were expressed in Western and some Russian historiography that the Allies could have captured Berlin first, but deliberately ceded the honor to the Red Army. Documentary investigations show that the political decision was made in advance. Anglo-American troops concentrated their efforts on advancing south and preparing for the meeting on the Elbe, not wanting to artificially escalate the confrontation. With Moscow, a special layer of myths is associated with the personalities of those who took part in the assault. The names of those who raised the victory banner, the commanders, as well as mass legends about miracle weapons, secret laboratories, and Nazi leaders who committed suicide. Some versions emerged during the Cold War, such as the fate of Hitler, who allegedly escaped from the bunker, or secret negotiations between the SS and the Allies about surrender. Underlying the historical disputes are deeper questions about the justification of the enormous sacrifices, the morality of the total assault on the city, and the fate of prisoners and those who went missing. When examining all versions, it is important to stick to documentary evidence. The mass destruction of city neighborhoods and the deaths of thousands of civilians were a tragedy for both sides. In recent years, owners of new archives and memoirs have shed new light on the fates of residents and prisoners, as well as the specific nature of the relationship between the population and the victors. Contemporary historians agree that any world war leaves behind unresolved issues and gray areas. No matter how bright and clear-cut the victory may seem, behind every official order and paragraph of a report lie the fates of human beings. New research will continue to emerge in the future, shedding light on the hidden pages of history. The Battle of Berlin will remain in human history not only as the final battle of the greatest war, but also as a large-scale human drama, a lesson and a warning for future generations. Millions of people took part in it, as heroes, as victims, as witnesses. Every participant in the battle, every family that survived the death of loved ones or the siege itself, every country on the continent left an indelible mark on those events. The operation became an example of a unique combination of will, strategy, and technology, but also a reminder of the price that war exacts from people, cities, and families. Monuments, memorial plaques, and museums have been erected on the sites of heroic battles. To this day, flowers are laid at the foot of monuments in Treptow Park, on Mamayev Kurgan, and at the Mausoleum of the Unknown Soldier. The memory of thousands of nameless heroes who defended or stormed the city has been preserved for generations. Historians, writers, and filmmakers are still searching for answers. Could so many casualties have been avoided? Were the decisions made justified? And how can the lessons of that war be preserved? For millions of people in Russia, Germany, and Eastern Europe, the terrible spring days of 1945 remain synonymous with tears, courage, determination, and the persistent hope that such a battle will never happen again. Today, few people can personally recount the battles, but chronicles, documents, and memoirs carry on the memory of that great operation. It is our duty not to let it be forgotten, to honor the heroes, to understand the causes of the tragedies, and to cherish the peace that our ancestors fought so hard to achieve.